off the beginning of it. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am your host, Ashley. I'm here with former guest and host Roxanne Ahern, Happy Holistic Homestead, our good friend of the show, and first-time guest Katherine Pakaluk. We are going to talk today about Katherine's book, Hannah's Children. Roxanne, I like to talk a little bit about the origin stories of these episodes. Roxanne reached out to me when we were, tweeting about the birth dearth, the antinatalist culture we live in and what we can do about it. And so this is why this conversation got started. I'll have first Roxanne introduce herself, say a little why this episode got started, and then we'll have Katherine introduce herself.
Okay, well, I'm Roxanne, and yeah, I've known Ashley for a little bit, and Katherine, I read your book last year, and I think I might have heard about it on Twitter, and gave it a read. I have 5 children, and so I'm always interested about stories of women with large families, and I think as a mother of all girls too, I'm curious how to support them the best way as they grow up on either becoming a mother and having a family, because for me it was the most fulfilling thing that I've done, and but also possibly if their life doesn't take that path, how do I want to make sure that I'm supporting my girls in the best way, because I don't necessarily feel like the culture is supporting
Right.
them
Right.
very well right now. And um yeah, I just hoped that you could come and talk to us about how you hear a lot of people talk about the population collapse, but we're not hearing a lot of solutions. And in your book, it seemed to be too, what you noticed in your research was that even when countries created policies to try to encourage people to have more kids, it wasn't really working. And so, yeah, we're just interested in your thoughts about, how can we make our culture more friendly to large families, and to help women be encouraged to want to do that, since it seems like a lot of them that do feel super fulfilled by it.
Okay, great. Katherine, introduce yourself.
Sure. It is such a pleasure to be here with you guys. It's one of the good things about the interwebs, right? Is that we meet people that we would otherwise not be able to meet. And actually, so I guess all right. So I'll introduce myself. I I'd like to say I'm a mom, I'm a wife. I live in the greater Washington area outside of Washington, D.C. I teach at the Catholic University in Washington, which is about a mile from the Capitol building, for better or for worse. And we mostly say for worse, but that's that's because of DC culture. Um, in terms of, I love the thought of building a holistic homestead, and actually I think there's a lot of wisdom about what makes for a good family life and a homestead, and what makes for a good college life and like a holistic college life. So I think we could borrow a lot from that. In any case, that's what I do. Sort of my day job is I teach wonderful, wonderful college students, and for me it feels like an extension of my motherhood, and such a privilege to be able to lean into the formation of young women and young men at a time when my own babies are leaving the house. So, so that's kind of like just a quick description of what my work is. And then about 5 or 6 years ago now, I started working on this book project, which we'll talk a little bit about. But I actually think it kind of fits the title of your podcast so well. I love the title of your podcast, Doomer Optimism, and I don't want to presume why you picked it, but I will say that I think the topic of declining births and our antinatalist culture, right? It's a little bit doomerish. It's a serious topic. A journalist this morning said, "Are we in a crisis?" And I said, "Well, I don't really like to be alarmist about anything, but certainly it's grim. I mean, the trends look kind of grim and serious." On the other hand, I think there's a lot of things to be optimistic about, and I hoped that a lot of what was in my book was like wildly optimistic for a lot of reasons. So, so that's an introduction. And just so if for anybody who doesn't know, in my book, I traveled around the country and I interviewed people like Roxanne who have sort of more than normal numbers of children. I hesitate to use the word normal, but we'll just say bigger than trend. And really just asked a package of questions designed to get at kind of why you would do this. Like, why in a world of falling birth rates do you have the family that you have? And what do you think it means for your family and for maybe the future of the country? I did ask people to extrapolate a little bit. And so it was so much fun. It was such a great project. I met people that I would never have otherwise met. And it was, again, just a real privilege to hear from all of these different women, their stories, how they arrived at motherhood, what surprised them about it, what they loved most about it. So I tried to kind of wrangle all of those interviews. These were long interviews, by the way, 2 or 3 hours. I tried to wrangle them all into a coherent narrative that aims to be both serious and optimistic.
Mm, I love that
Yeah.
so much. And as a
Yeah.
fellow qualitative researcher, I feel your pain
Yes.
trying to
Yes, right?
interview people and then like make it into something coherent. Okay,
Yes.
so a lot of times on this podcast, we try to start with the doom and then move toward the optimism. So like what's the state of the problem that we're
Yeah.
facing here? How bad is it? As you see it? And then we can start moving toward different ways to conceptualize what the optimism might be.
Right. Yeah. So it looks bad. I'm gonna lie, it looks bad. But let me try to put some context on that. It's basically the quick description of the problem is that most countries are these days not having enough children to replace their own populations. And so that just means at ipso facto, like at some point, a declining, not just a declining birth rate, we've had that for a long, long time, but a declining actual population. So the number of people in a country. It's hard to think about this at the country level, but almost everybody knows about a city or maybe even their place of birth or place of origin that's declining or that's been declining. And so that's kind of when you picture like, this kind of, I don't know, like Rust Belt towns that people think about or places that people were born, but nobody ever stays. Um, that's actually what we have to think about at the level of a whole country. So think about a whole country kind of getting rusty and outdated and not having enough people to staff the local Waffle House or whatever it might be. That's the picture. And for a while, what happens is countries can kind of kick the can down the road because births are funny. The inversion of the population pyramid happens kind of really slowly, and there's always a lot of people around, so it kind of looks like, well, how could we be facing? But what you'll see is that they'll kind of like things will kind of accelerate. So just like you could imagine, if everybody had 10 kids, the population would, we'll say explode really quickly. And in the same way that if everybody has like one child or one and a half children, the population can turn really quickly from a time where you have like, seems like things are pretty crowded to all of a sudden things are pretty sparse. So you ask like, how bad is it? Well, basically the way to think about it is sort of like, it's bad enough at this point that probably within our near lifetime, like in the next decade, countries all around the world, including our own, will have to start revising downward the amount of government spending that we're used to, which, depending on your political leanings, is either a good thing or a bad thing. So, right. But I mean, I would say, like, for most of sort of the popular discourse, that strikes people as a bad thing. And so what I mean is like the entitlement payments, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, um, you know, probably things like military expenditures will be the last to go, but I don't really know, to be honest. I'm not a make a prophetic announcements, but it will be enough that people go, oh, this is different. This is different and new. And then I'd like to say the other two things that are worth being a little concerned about, not alarmist, political polarization. So people think a lot about polarization as being grounded in like maybe irrational, uh, well, it's always irrational. I think hatred is irrational, but I think people talk a lot, like certainly where I live, a lot of flags out, people are against hate. I'm against hate too, but I think what's happened right now is people can't kind of figure out like, why are we so polarized? And I want to just point out that there's a kind of simple population-based polarization that occurs when people feel threatened, their way of life feels threatened. And so maybe without even realizing it, without even like generating more hate than normal people, there may be political instability coming from people feeling threatened by their own countries, states, villages feeling underpopulated. And then the last thing, and probably this is the most important thing, is for the same number of people, if you have tinier families, you will have fewer brothers and sisters, fewer cousins, fewer aunts and uncles. For many people, like they won't even have a cousin. So that just sort of means like actually a more individualistic society where people don't really know what it means to see other people as family. And I think that's like a hidden cause of individualism that is worth exploring. So that's kind of how bad it is. I don't know. The United States, we're at 1.6 births per expected per woman, which doesn't like mean anything. It sounds like this weird statistic, but it just means that like most women will have zero, one, or two children in their lifetime. And that number is trending toward one.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Roxanne,
Yeah.
anything else on the doom? I have a couple other follow-up questions.
Okay.
The doom. I think you should go first.
So part of the way I've been conceptualizing this is like, just from a basic demography point of view, the inverted pyramid means like these there's a lot of older people and less younger people, and just practically it seems to me what that will mean is, people say things like, and you think about this practically in many people's lives, there's care that's needed on both ends of one's life,
Yeah.
as a baby and as a elderly person. And so you have this situation where, a lot of times people say, I have this many kids because I want somebody to take care of me in my old age. So you've got all these older people, a lot of childless older people, and then not enough people either both paying into, the like Social Security and these kinds of systems that then give
Yep.
entitlements to older people, but also like even if we didn't want to go through the government way of taking care of our elderly, even on a practical interdependent level, we're going to have a lot more people who will need that care and not enough people, young people, to sort of like be in the workforce and to take care of that whole demographic group. Does that
Yeah.
also resonate with you?
Well, that's a huge concern. Yeah, I should like start leading with this, especially since in the time since the book came out, we've seen countries like Canada really lean into, what I think is sort of like the logical conclusion, which is, soft or hard inducements to persuade elderly people to not be a burden, right? So medical aid and dying
Hmm.
program, which we've seen in Canada, and then people are looking into it. Like, it turns out a lot more people are opting into this than they were kind of expecting. And so yeah, that will create pressure. There won't be enough people to support. People are talking about robots being used. So as you pointed out, like either not enough money to support people or actually not enough human beings to come and really provide that kind of really tender care. Because like just like you mentioned, right, as when you're a kid and also when you're older, and we don't just want a stranger taking care of us. We want someone who really can muster up some kind of real action. I mean, that's what I hope for. And I know we've taken care of a couple of dying relatives, and um, it's night and day, like what family does and what strangers do. Um, so yeah, it's a huge concern, and I think we're going to see more and more, more and more, really kind of apocalyptic scenarios of trying to repaint early death as being in someone's interest.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
And now, okay, I have a couple other like maybe I know this is sad
doomer
for you,
ideas.
Roxanne, but some other doom parts, which is, okay, so what do we think is behind this? And it's not just in the US. There's like a lot of advanced economies are having this
Oh
sort
yeah,
of really declining, rapidly declining birth rate. What is your hypothesis at the
yeah,
moment? I mean, I know people try to blame it on so many different things.
yeah,
And the same thing with like basically any doom we talk about on this show. It's like, well, it started with the Industrial Revolution. No, it actually started with the Agricultural Revolution. No, it actually
yeah,
started with, writing or
yeah,
whatever. But so how far back do you place the beginning of this?
yeah. Um, okay, so let me take you for a ride. So I do go back pretty far with this. And I'm gonna sort of distinguish between two things. Like one is a kind of we'll say like it's the zeitgeist or the spirit of antinatalism, which is something that for me has always been present. I think there's always been a tendency to if if not um, if not question the goodness of human life, to sort of to turn human life into something that's utilitarian. So you can find all kinds of cultures that, if they didn't reject all new human life, they rejected the wrong kind of human life. And we could say like the weakest people, the sickest people. Go back and think about ancient Greece and think about ancient Rome, and then we could kind of work through, how does Christianity handle that whole dilemma? And I personally would propose that Christianity kind of like asserts a certain kind of um, set of postulates about the desirability of infants and weakness and right and the lovability of people. Um, so I think that's a really important thing to tease apart. And so I kind of want to put that on the table, which is I'll certainly go all the way far back and I'll say I think there's always been a kind of yin and a yang there, or a kind of a culture of life and a culture of death. And I think we can't ignore that. It has spiritual roots, and I think it's still alive. It's still alive and well. We could point to that. But I'm going to go ahead and like embrace a couple pieces of the technological story too, um, if that's fair. And that story I think goes back to, by and large, like at least as far as we can look at the data, it's sort of like early 1800s. And I think this is where the economist in me is going to say, all right, there are uh, essentially two reasons people do things. They either really need to or they really want to. And so with children, as much as I just said that a tendency of the culture of death, which has always been around, is to view them in a utilitarian way, it's certainly true that children can meet needs and they have met needs in the past. And so we could look back and we say, well, there was a time when whether or not you wanted children, you better have a few, right? And we would be thinking there about when you are surviving in a homestead situation, domestic environment where they're useful for labor. If you have domestic animals, people don't think about this at all. You never have to send your kid out to change your oil, or you wouldn't. But if you have an animal that's really part of your sustenance, the care of animals really requires more hands. And that's a wonderful thing, such a wonderful thing for kids to grow up taking care of animals and being part of that domestic economy, we could say. So the domestic economy kind of goes away, right? Little by little by little, it goes away, at least insofar as children can contribute to the domestic economy. And that's a little piece of we'll say a good thing, which is economic growth. People become wealthier. It's no longer like all hands on deck. We are actually going to not survive if we don't have, more. You do have advancements in child survival, so they're not all going to die. We do know, like, if you map out how many children survive into adulthood, it doesn't look like birth rates fell as much in the 1800s as just the number of births, right? So you go from it's like 8 to 4 over the 1800s if you just look at numbers of births. But if you look at surviving children, it looks like more like 4 or 5 down to like 3 or 4. So there was definitely a sense in which people were overshooting. But just to stick with my narrative here, children used to be fairly useful, economically useful, we could say, and that they've suffered a kind of economic wound in relation to various technologies. And one would be like the package of technologies we think of as part of economic growth. So not just the industrial revolution, but of course that's part of it. Also like global trade and all the kinds of things that lift human flourishing in terms of like just the overall quality of life. But then we could go forward. Okay, then you mentioned this. Children are pretty useful for old age support. And that we definitely dismantled more or less on purpose. Probably with a view to the safety net would be the right way to see it. I don't think it was nefarious, but when you propose, okay, look, nobody who happens to not have had children will have to worry about not being supported. Like there's a good instinct in that. But
Yep.
then you put in place something that guarantees support if you don't have children. It clearly undermines a reason to have children, right?
Yeah.
Right? Unless you sort of qualify that in some way. And we could talk about that, like the nitty gritty of that. There's some really interesting new studies out about the way in which pension programs have eaten away at the incentive to have children. So that's, I mean, I think of like really, really huge, large scale government programs as a kind of technology because they do depend on a kind of techne. Um, for instance, when the Social Security Act was put in place in 1936, it took them like 6 or 7 years to actually start making payments. And I ask my students, like, do you know why that takes them so long? You have to go out and enroll everybody. Right? There's no like way to just enroll everybody. So they have to drop these little offices all over the country. They have to find people and then assign them a number. It's like it's actually when you go back and look at it, you go, oh, this is kind of like, I mean, maybe it's all for good purpose, but there's aspects of this like numbering everybody that are certainly part of, we'll say, like the machine age. Okay. And then the
Wait,
last
I'll
thing
just
I'll
bring.
just
I want you to do your last point, but I'll just briefly point out that we have a woman who's a friend of the show, Katura Hickman, whose family's
yes,
part of this whole like anti-Social Security,
yes,
going back to the beginning, just like I don't want to be surveilled, I don't want to be numbered,
yep.
I don't want to be tracked, kind of thing. And I'm
I
like,
have,
you
I
know,
don't know Katora. I know of her. I have huge respect for that, and I'm increasingly interested in it. So
yeah,
I discovered that like the Amish refused to go into the system, and I was like, wow, like this is amazing. And then early on, like they were attacked, and the feds came and like took crops and livestock in order to sort of count for their payments that they weren't making. Oh, and later they negotiated a truce. But I was like, this is amazing. My mind is
yes,
blown. I have
yes,
huge respect for it. Yeah, I think like nobody questions it, but it's very clear, certainly in hindsight, that these kind of mechanical systems, like where it's automatic, you pay in, it's automatic, you're going to get a payout. They certainly, like on paper, they reduce the incentive to have children.
right. And then I interrupted you. You had one
Yeah,
final point.
yeah. And the final thing, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, but it turns people's heads a little bit upside down because we're so used to thinking of this on the backside, which is that children, so we're talking about the ways in which children are needed. And children are really needed if you want to be intimate and partner up and mate, right? So I think mating is a really basic human instinct. We'll discuss whether having children is a basic human instinct, but fundamentally, prior to really effective hormonal contraception, if you wanted to couple up, children were like the price of union, at least on some level. You could avoid kids in different ways. It wasn't particularly easy to do it. You could kind of space, there were things you could do, but it wasn't that effective. So ultimately, unless you wanted to live a mostly celibate life, you were probably going to have a couple kids, even if you didn't want like a whole gaggle of children, right? And so the way to think about it is there's another sort of wound that children suffer because of a suite of technologies that made children sort of optional to human mating. And so yeah, like you could get married, you could go to like do your PhD like we did and like never have a kid along the way. And so we know actually that in the advent of the pill, women's educational attainment really soared because all of a sudden women wanted to do these things that would have required being celibate or postponing partnership for too long. So that's like a bundle of three things. And basically, the way I see it is like there's been a dramatic collapse in the kinds of things that would make children wantable, or I was needable. Like you need to have kids in order to like function as an adult.
Mm.
And so fast forward to today, and like you can function as an adult, do well, set yourself up, like do all kinds of great things. You never actually sort of have to confront the moment where it's like, if I don't have a kid, like my life is going to be qualitatively worse. And so I think what we're seeing now is a kind of an interesting, it's like when a sculptor reveals like something in relief. They chisel away at something, you go, oh, like now I can see what's really there. I think that what we're seeing now is that the people who still have children, in spite of this like lack of need, are the people who have reasons for a very sincere want. In other words, like they can articulate the desirability of the child in some particular way that's rational, it's intelligible, it's often related to faith, but not always. And that's the kind of nugget of interest that I have is like, what are the ways people articulate that children could be desirable and wantable, in spite of the fact that your life, at least in the short term, isn't going to be qualitatively better. Like you're not driven by economic need to have your children.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So that's what I think is
Roxanne.
going
Yeah,
on.
that's
It's I took
perfect.
you on a
Roxanne.
ride,
Yeah.
but it's I think it makes sense when you kind of piece it all together.
Yep. Roxanne, I'll let you go. Sorry, I've been hogging the mic.
Oh, no, no, this is awesome. I thought it was interesting because we talked about the Industrial Revolution, and it's true. There's so many things that, if you kind of go back there, I mean, that was a big crossroads for humanity. Obviously, it changed things. I kind of feel like we're at another crossroads right now with how much we're going to allow tech to be a part of us, to be a
Mm.
physical
Yep.
body
Yep.
of our homes, of all of it. But I think something that I read in your book that was interesting is I think you said it was around the 1950s, was sort of marriage. And so I think it took some time because when you go back to pre-industrial revolution, it was like all hands on deck. Every member of the household had a purpose, and they were all working together towards a common goal, which was the family business,
Yes.
feeding themselves, whatever it was. Everybody was kind of on the same team though, because you had to be. And then when fathers left home to work, that really changed, I think, the power dynamic at home.
Hmm.
And then you pointed out that once women really started going into the workforce, like in the 50s, not because it was because of the war or anything, but just like they were making different decisions to go get educated. And there was so many more women going to college and opting for that. It was like instead of spouses being partners, they became sort of adversaries.
Mm.
Instead of working towards a common goal, they were fighting one another for time, for resources, whatever it was. It was like the goals of the family really, it wasn't a unified family goal anymore. And so I'm just wondering, you know, how do you get that back as a family? If you have a working mother, a working father, and the kids are all playing sports and you're not running a homestead together kind of thing. Is there hope for, I mean, I don't know. It seems like all that led to the unity and it would be hard to sort of reconstruct it out of
Yeah.
that. Does that make sense? How do we get back to a place where families felt like they were united and fighting for a similar goal?
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I sort of don't think there's a lot of hope it will happen mechanically or sort of like automatically, unless like all of society collapses. Like I think because I think that there's um but I'm not rooting for that, by the way. I don't
No,
think.
I know, but there's part of the theme of this podcast is
That's
like
what
either we do this intentionally or like we're going to be forced to do it. So,
Yes, no, no, I think you're not wrong. I mean, it could happen. I don't know what things will look like when all the governments go bankrupt because they're going bankrupt, right? I mean, this is sort of this is the this is the tone. And so I don't know that I think everything would collapse, but if it did, I guess we'd be forced back into it. I think one of the nice things about the lack, like, this is fair to say, when there isn't technology, what technology does is it overcomes our natural weaknesses, right? The problem for the like uber technologists, the people who like think all technology is great, is that they have to try to they see every limitation as a weakness. Whereas I think for me at least, I would think more about the telos of certain weaknesses. Like so, as a woman, I remember when I was dating my husband being drawn to the strength of his hands and the strength of his arms. That's a weird thing to remember, but I remember just being like, wow, like gosh, like and I've since learned that that's actually pretty common. Women really are drawn to the strength of no, but there's a reason for that, and this is to your point, Roxanne. Like there's a complementarity. Now, it's technology that's allowed us to overcome the weakness that I have. Like my hands are weak, but most of the things I need to do in the day, I don't need to rely on the strength or weakness of my hands, or my husband's strong hands, right? Most of what he does is he pecks on a keyboard with those great strong hands. He's got these hands that are like made for manual labor. his fingers are like an inch thick, and I just think like, what a waste. Like he should be, doing. He does chop wood really great. So, but I think that's the challenge is because I think there's something innate in us that we build these tools to overcome weaknesses. There's nothing wrong with that. Like if I'm a guy out in the field, I'm going to build a machine to help. And I mean, I wouldn't want to. But the problem for the universal techno optimists, I guess we'll say, is that they don't have a framework for questioning when a kind of technology might be actually undermining the telos of that weakness. And
Yeah.
right, I mean,
Yeah, we strip away something we didn't know.
yeah,
We kind of lose it.
exactly, right, because the difference in the strength of my husband's hands and mine is meant to tell us something, right? It brings us together as like, well, look, I'm going to be really good at this and you're going to be really good at this, right? Like I'm way better, I'm softer, I'm way better at nurturing my children in times of like I just skinned my knee or I bumped my head. I don't want to run to my dad's rough embrace at that moment. And of course I'm generalizing, and of course
Yeah.
there's, exceptions to all these things. But when you see that your two strengths and weaknesses complement each other in the face of certain external needs, of course, that's like the most bonding thing that there is. So, what do we do? Is this to your question? And it does seem like the answer. I hope I'm not like just saying what you guys have been doing forever on this podcast, but the answer is actually you have to build it with intention. You have to say like, well, all right, we're going to limit ourselves in certain ways in order to embrace those complementarities. But then, yeah, then you're asking for something that I think is, humanly speaking, quite difficult, which is to sort of reconstruct through intention something that doesn't fall from the sky into our laps anymore, and to somehow, like at the same time, be grateful for the things that that are falling from the sky into our laps. I mean, I'm still somebody who's going to say like I'm pretty thrilled with the abundance that we have on account of our tools, right? That our children are not likely to be malnourished. I mean so these technologies, like they cut both ways, right? But yeah, like if my husband had to walk 5 miles to the grocery store to provision us, would I be even more grateful to him than I am now? And I probably would be,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I'm wondering whether we can talk about one more kind of pretty hyper doomery thing before we move towards some of the examples of optimism that you have in your book. But I'm thinking of, okay, so every time I mention anything about technology on the internet or on this podcast or whatever, people say like, "Oh, you want us to go back into the Stone Age?" I'm like, "Okay, no." Just because I have some kind of critique doesn't mean I want it all to go away. We can have both, some of these positive aspects of, technological advances without going so far in the other direction. But the doomer thing that I see on the horizon is things like um, technology and reproduction, surrogacy, artificial wombs, and you're going so far in the direction of um, thinking that technology will relieve you of some kind of human weakness that I think you're even starting now to go like almost towards leaning into more weaknesses that are a result of these technologies. Like you're getting
Yeah.
so many health issues and so many like not just philosophical issues but like psychological issues and this kind of thing that results from this hyper technology. So I'm just wondering, I don't know how that like super techno optimist hyper uh tech person fits into
Yeah.
this story.
Well, I don't know. I want to say I think I see the same concern. I get interviewed by a lot of people who are curious about the pronatalist movement, trying to figure out if I'm a pronatalist or not. And typically, because I wrote this book, they assume I'm a pronatalist, and I'm always like, "Can we define pronatalism?" And then I'll tell you if I'm a pronatalist. Depends what we mean by
Yes,
pronatalism.
exactly. Yeah.
But what your point about IVF and other assisted reproductive technologies is really kind of like it's right at the edge of that whole question, right? In fact, I mean, it's so nutcase I shouldn't read it to you, but I've got an email sitting in my inbox like from some dude who wrote to me and said, "I'd really like to see you promote cloning and like more
Oh
research
my
into
god.
cloning."
No.
And I'm like, "This is ridiculous. I don't even know if that's going to ever be a thing, but like obviously if we're working on it, no way. Like no thank you." But, obviously we've got some prominent pronatalists, people who do call themselves pronatalists who are promoting IVF, and yeah, I think it really brings us back to that need to ask the kind of question, those like fundamental questions about what places we have to limit ourselves because, yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean,
Yeah,
it's the kind of thing that you could kind of tell like the best use case example for it. Um, and nobody's going to be that upset about it, but man, it does already open the door to all of these frozen embryos that we don't know what to do with, and so many other ways in which it the problem in the first place was devaluing human life. So you go like, wait a second, have we fixed it or have we made it worse?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. All right, I'll let Roxanne steer us towards optimism now.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. This one might be a little bit doomer, but it can be
Right.
I just found this interesting because a lot of what has changed the number of children that women are having is obviously more opportunities that have
Yep.
opened to women,
Yep.
right? They not only do they have access to birth control now, but they can go to school, they can have career paths they couldn't have. Their lives are so much more full of possibility than they
Yep.
were 100 years ago. But then
Right.
this fact really, again, it makes me think of my own daughters because I have one who's 15. And so we're really thinking about, well, what is your path going to be like? What path do you want to take? And how I, as a mother, could best encourage her. And I just found it so interesting when you talked about the women's happiness paradox,
Yeah.
because the data shows that women's happiness has been on a steady decline since the 1970s. So why, now that their lives are more open and more things are possible than ever before, why do women feel more unhappy than ever before? And that's pretty wild. I mean, what do you guys think about that? Is it just because my first instinct is it because now they're expected to do it all? Did they are is it are they so overburdened because maybe now you're supposed to have a family and be successful in a career? And is that what, I mean, what do you guys think?
Catherine, let you go.
Well, yeah, I think the sort of second shift story has got to be a piece of it, which is that, doing two jobs, feeling overburdened and overwhelmed. It's got to be a piece of it. But I would also say like it's probably good not to avoid completely the um the kid story. So it's not just that you're having kids and you're working, and that's hard because it is hard, and I think it um but what we are also seeing is this decline of birth rate. So more and more women are single longer, are not transitioning to motherhood even when they might have said that they wanted to. So this is a kind of paradox. It seems like in the era of reproductive control, how come women aren't getting the families that they want or they say they want? And so I'm not sure it's merely disappointment at not getting what you wanted. I think there's a piece of that, but I also think we have fairly robust data that says that for most women, I mean, we don't want to universalize anything, but for most women, children contribute very positively to their overall well-being and happiness. And so if births are going down, again, it's like it doesn't happen like the same for everybody, but what's happening is really more people are staying in the zero child bucket, and then there's more people in the one. So you're kind of having a rise in people who are never having children, and they don't, not even with one children or one child, do they have that positive feedback. So I think we have to examine that, like that actually the loss of children from our lives is what's at least contributing to that growing sense of unhappiness. Um, the thing that's difficult about this, and this is fresh in my mind because I was talking to a BBC reporter this morning, it's like as much as I believe that children contribute positively to women's happiness, I also don't think it doesn't follow that we can sort of like hand that to people or um, like choose it for them. This is, I think, the real difficulty for like the modern policymaker is that the things that people most need to be happy and to live good lives are not things we can redistribute easily, if at all. Whereas I think like 100 years ago, you could really make a difference for somebody if you helped them avoid devastating poverty, or even like you could redistribute certain types of capital. You could give men tools, and it would really make a difference. The guy a guy near the ocean with a fishing net could really support his family. A guy with a hammer could really go to work. And so if the hammer prevented him from showing up at the work site, you could fix that. But this is something that I think deeply has to be a matter of like something that women and men opt into, like they choose. I don't think we can redistribute that. But so that's this paradox that you're mentioning. It doesn't bear a simple explanation, but I think it's really compelling. I do think it's compelling by like, or maybe convicting is the point. Like
Mm.
you look at it, you think like, I have tremendous sorrow for people who, for whatever reason, like their lives didn't hand them the opportunity. They didn't know that they wanted it till it was too late. I mean, there's so many ways this happens to people, and it's not only a matter of missed opportunities in people's personal lives, but of course we have to accept at this point that the social script, all the expectations don't really support that kind of transition at an age when for most people it would be possible to become mothers. So it's like I simultaneously like have profound um, sorrow for people who missed an opportunity, but also like it doesn't follow that there's any way we can sort of pass it out to people, right? So like it's very thorny.
So
And
could you
by the way, not to mention, I'm going to go ahead and say it really quickly, very briefly. Not to mention, we don't want to be in the business of shaming people who don't. At least I don't. I won't put words in
Yes.
your mouths, but I
Yeah.
don't want to be in the business of shaming people who, for whatever reason, didn't manage it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
it's such a difficult conversation because it's so hard. You want to acknowledge like, children bring happiness, and I'm not sure about these technologies, and
yeah,
there's a lot of
right.
like thorny philosophical issues involved with like
Yes,
IVF and surrogacy and these different things, but then people feel judged, or they think I'm a victim of the sociological moment, which is true. So all we can really do, and this is my intention, is to kind of talk about positive
yeah,
examples, positive
yes,
stories, and maybe we can move towards that. Like, what did you see in common with a lot of the mothers of many
yeah,
children in your book that was like, are they just really agentic? Are they just super headstrong? What is it that they had this? Did they have like a rock bottom moment, or are they from like a culture where they it incentivize these things? What are some of the
yeah.
takeaways?
Well, the quick there's just two. Well, I guess there's like two pieces to it, and I'll try to make it quick. 'Cause we can get into some of the more interesting parts. But the first part is like, and I want to put this in the cleanest terms possible, is that that we're not Malthusians. Put it this way. What I mean by that, which like I'm learning now, like I wrote the book, 2 years ago, but it was published a year ago, but I'm learning like it takes another year to figure out actually what you're trying to say. And that's, something I owe to all of the great people who've asked me questions. What Malthus gets wrong is that he basically thinks like human agency, the drama of kind of like the heart and choice isn't engaged in childbearing, that we basically breed like animals.
Right.
Right. That's what he gets wrong. And of course he gets it wrong in one direction. He basically thinks we're likely to just like have too many kids and
Just
it'd be so,
overbreed because we
yeah,
have so much
like we're just
abundance.
gonna copulate as long as there's like resources, or like as long as I have enough brownies on the table, I'm just gonna like jump in the bed and have a kid. This is weird, like I get it. In the late 1700s, people are really interested in these like biological trends. It's like this explosion of thinking about things this way. Anyway, but you can make that same mistake in another direction, which is that as we look at birth rates declining, you can look at that as sort of like, if I have a Malthusian outlook, which is that I think that basically people have like a universal propensity to just have kids. And so then I can look around and I can be like, oh, there's not enough kids. Something must be wrong. And when you say that, what you more or less mean is like the system uh, is somehow preventing the births that people really want to have. Now, as we just described, there are ways in which, if you live in a society where very few people transition to children, yes, there are aspects of like social norms that make it harder to have kids. But when you just say like the system is keeping us from having kids, you're avoiding the fact that people are making these agonizing life choices. And I really think the agony of the life choice is like where all the action is. All right. So because I believe this doesn't mean I don't think that there are structural things that could be at play, right? Okay. So the simple answer is there's two parts. The first is to see the childbearing of women who don't fit the norm, so the outliers. And I would, by the way, I think this must be very true of the outliers in the other direction, the people who have zero children, people who have below the norm, but that the people above the norm, which is the people I studied, that they have reasons for what they're up to. Like they didn't copulate because they happened to belong to a religious group or because they were Amish or because like that they're still, each child is a decision and there's a reason behind that decision. So that sounds so basic. And yet when you spell it out that way, you realize actually people assume that that's not true. So they look at you, I don't know about you, Roxanne, and they say like, oh, do you know how that happens? It's like, okay, it's kind of funny for a minute, right? But actually it belies this kind of like uh it's kind of antinatalist, but this sense that like there isn't there wasn't a choice involved. Like, yeah, like it's almost mind-blowing to think that you would look at somebody in public with a bunch of kids and sort of make a joke about it just happening to them. Like, yeah, you're right. We have no idea. Like, I just keep turning up
Yeah.
pregnant, right? Like, it's insane. So
Yeah.
that's a kind of other type of Malthusianism that I think is still present. So the first part of it is actually to reveal the human face um, behind these, like I call them like positive outliers, people who have live children in spite of a social trend going the other direction. And actually, it turns out it's very interesting because people are so interesting. It turns out actually there's no like single story. There's no one way that it happens. You didn't have to grow up with a lot of kids. You could grow up as an only child and think I'd really love to have more children myself. So the first point, I said it was going to be 2 points. First point is that people have reasons and that those reasons are really, really interesting and they help you to draw, I think, healthy conclusions about the kinds of things that could make a difference. The second thing is that if, abusing my data a little bit, abusing it a little bit, I would say that it looks like, although my my sample is not representative, it's not a population sample. Um, I know enough about what the population samples look like that I don't think I'm too far off. But that most women who choose this lifestyle, um, the reason that a large part of the reason why they are open to having children is derived from some kind of Abrahamic faith. That is something gets them started, at least initially. I like to say there's something gets you started and something keeps you going. Something gets you started often has to do with a kind of ideal related to the value of human life, and that very often has some kind of expression in Abrahamic faith. So I'd say like that ancient tradition of seeing children as blessings, seeing children as the purpose of your marriage, being open to transitioning to parenthood sooner than I would say the culture would typically suggest. And that oftentimes, as I outlined, people kept going as much because of that ideal as because of the experience. So like they thought, okay, like at this point, like I would just have as many as I can because it's so rewarding. I love this so much. And that's unknown to a lot of people. So I kind of try to reveal that, but it's sort of it's like a 1-2. It's like there's these Abrahamic ideals, and then there's this experience of like a kind of explosion of joy. Like there's more joy that gets added, and trying to document how that takes place. I think that was something of like trying to reveal for people that having more than normal numbers of children can actually, it bears a lot of resemblance to other interesting things that people do, like running marathons and climbing mountains. And, where you look at it, you go like, I don't think I would like to do that, but I would like to watch a documentary about it because it's pretty neat. Like I think that's what's generated, I think, a lot of interest in this project is we were able to get enough words on what people are up to that people who don't want to share this lifestyle at all can still see it and say, there's a romance there. I
Mhm.
can see that although I wasn't prepared, I didn't have an opportunity to opt into this, or I'm not sure I would want to opt into this. This is pretty interesting. Like there's a lot more here than I thought, which is kind of usually how I end up thinking like by the, second hour of the Mount Everest documentaries or the crazy climber people. I'm like, I could never do it, but like I can see what they love about this. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that was the second piece.
Roxanne, you want to go?
Um, No, I'm just listening. I something something that struck me when I was going through the book for the second time was I was thinking about risk taking and how as we get older, even now, like before I had my first baby, like when my husband and I started dating, we
Yeah.
used to go skydiving on a
Oh
regular
my
basis.
goodness. Oh my
Really?
goodness.
That's
That's
funny.
wanted to be like an instructor. We
Oh
thought
my
he
goodness. I am terrified of the concept.
I I was too, but then that's why I did it is because I was so afraid of heights and
Mm.
I'm gonna do things I'm afraid
Wow.
of here. And so I did that. I almost chickened out. Would have chickened out if Jeff hadn't have been there because the plane went up way late and I was like, oh, it's a sign. We
Oh
got to
my
get out.
goodness.
And so anyway, that was kind of our thing. But now I look back on it and I'm like, no, never do I have that desire to ever jump out of a plane again. And I think, we talk about how your frontal lobe is not really done being like the amount of risk taking that the
Yeah.
adolescent brain is willing to do is almost necessary to launch yourself into life, like to move you out of your parents' house, to go away to college, to go
Yeah.
like I'm going to marry this person. You almost need a little bit of that sort of temperament, and the older you get, the more risk averse you get. And I've done that even with having babies. Like after my last baby, like I would love a bigger family, but it was hard on my body, and I stood more to lose. Like what if something happens to me and I leave all these children? Like you start thinking more in those terms instead of like let's just have another one. So I wonder sometimes about how delayed marriage, delayed child rearing, might get to a place in their brain where they're like, I don't want to do that at all. Cause you have to be willing to take risks, I think, to
Right.
want to, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
Oh, I think that is such a great point, and it's huge. And it reminds me, like, I don't know if you read Louise Perry. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
I feel like she touches on a lot of your themes too. Um, she she's maybe more doomer than optimist these days, but she's great. But she had a really nice piece, an essay in First Things magazine, December or something,
Yep.
where she kind of talks about this point about how there's likely to be sort of secular economic stagnation with fewer young people to take those entrepreneurial risks that lead to the growth of nations.
I'm going to have to
And
look at that piece. That sounds really interesting because I
yeah,
think a good point there. You need a certain, I mean,
yeah.
look,
So she says, well, as we get more graying populations and fewer young people, we're going to have fewer risk takers. There's a few fine points of the article that I don't 100% agree with, but I think that point that you're making, that fundamental attitude towards risk, is huge. I can give you a weird example from my life if you want.
Sure. Yeah.
No, I didn't skydive ever, but I did marry a widower with 6 children, which is probably like the moral equivalent of skydiving. So I was like, it's in there. I'll just tell you, like, we were 23. He wasn't 23. I was 23. And by the time I was heading up to 30, like we'd been married for, 6 or 7 years, I used to say to him all the time, I don't think I would have done this if I'd been closer to 30. But at 23, like I didn't, I thought like, well, like it'll work out and, God will provide and like I can conquer the world. I mean, it was like a lot of things. I didn't see a lot of the things that would be difficult. And I don't think that was merely that I didn't have enough wisdom to see them, but I think it was just, it's an attitude towards risk.
Yeah, and I,
Um,
I see on the opposite side of
yeah,
that, I see a lot of people delaying marriage and child rearing specifically as like a risk mitigation. Like I have to get to a certain amount
yes,
of a place in my career, a certain
yes,
amount of income, a certain amount of comfort before I can bring a kid in. And I've found, or at least in my life, or the people I know who have a lot of kids, it's like the having the kids or just getting married, it kind of launches you in a direction that's out of necessity. You sort of figure it out as you're going along, and you're like
yep,
forced, your hand is forced to figure it out, and you're
yes,
forced to mature, as
yes,
opposed to this idea that you're gonna wait forever, and then maybe you have fertility issues if you're
right,
too far along
right.
in your life and that kind of thing. So it's like, people think they're being risk averse on one end, but then they end up maybe having greater risk later on because
Yeah,
they, had this kind of incorrect calculation.
yeah. I think that's a great point. I don't think I've really thought about it in that way. I talk about like the unanticipated benefits of having children. Like, I'm not that old, and I have these like adult sons that I have so much fun with.
Right.
Think like, but I've never thought about it in the way you just put it, Ashley, which is I think a great one, which is like if I had seen my children as too big a risk to take, I would be facing more risk today, right?
Right.
Because today I've got already all my children aren't grown, but like if my husband dropped dead today, my college roommate's husband dropped dead last week, and we're not close. We've stayed in touch. It really hits home though. You think like, well, like I lived with you for a year. We were close friends. Your husband just passed. If my husband passed away today, I have a multitude of adult sons who make a good living who would take care of me. And so I haven't seen it the way you just put it, Ashley, but it strikes me as that's really interesting. The avoidance of a certain risk at a certain point can lead to greater risk later.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think people are just kind of poor, like in general, kind of poor at calculating these things.
Yeah.
And we talk
That's
about this on
also
the
true.
podcast all the time. They're just like, they see one immediate risk in front of them, but don't think about like maybe the downstream effects. I wonder if we can talk about the Abrahamic faith
Yeah.
aspect of this. I think there's
Yeah.
so much there, and probably could do a whole hour or
Yeah.
more on just that. But
Yes.
yeah, let's talk about that, because I think fundamentally there's a split between, I guess, those who think hyper rationally, hyper scientifically, hyper utilitarian ways about life in general and what is worth pursuing in life and how to understand the world. And then there's increasingly like a subset of people who are sort of finding that lacking. And I call
Yeah.
it spreadsheet brain on Twitter, where people are literally letting spreadsheet analyses like take over their intuitive understanding of the world, or how one understands what is meaningful, what is valuable, what's beautiful, what's true. So I wonder, yeah, what did you find in your book on this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just to the last way you phrase that, like the absolutely. So I really tried to tackle this sort of um as a like a leitmotif throughout the book, which is that the women I interviewed, they didn't they didn't fail to have rational plans for their lives, but they didn't plan their families in the way that like spreadsheet brain plans your family. Right. So like how do you tackle this? Which is like they're not family planners in the ordinary way. But it doesn't mean that like their kids were just surprises. Like they had no idea when the next child was coming, and they had no idea how to say like Roxanne say like I think I can't do it again, or like this is the end. I mean, so you for each child there was a lot of we'll say intentionality and kind of sizing up like what are my strengths, what do I have, like is this the right time. But there was definitely what I struggled to find language for, a kind of rejection of this kind of contemporary planning attitude. And some of the ways I tried to put language on that, I said that they believed that having children proved itself over time in ways that evaded human wisdom. I'm really happy with having like been inspired with that phrase, because I've come back to it like 8 times. Like, there's no other way to put it. This is what's going on. So, it's not like it's irrational behavior, but it's a kind of rationality that includes the expectation of I would say divine assistance, or even beyond like something we could say that divine assistance might mean to some people, like, oh, you get a surprise check in the mail. And I'm not quite sure that's what people were expecting, but like a kind of divine assistance in the way we might think about providence, like that God has, in the language of one of my interviewees, God ordained the world from its foundations, and he knows what's good for us, and that he has arranged like all things to work for our good. And so things that appear risky to an ordinary hyper rationalist calculating brain, Excel spreadsheet brain, uh, are not as risky, because this is something we know that God desires this. Like he loves children, and he gave us this capacity, and that capacity is good. And so again, not supplanting we'll say prudence, like, is this the right time? There's plenty of that in my book. There's a kind of like deference to a kind of old wisdom. And that was that was throughout. I found that throughout. And the last thing I'll say on that sort of Abrahamic faith idea, because I've now learned this is very helpful for people who haven't been inside of this tradition. Um, the women often use the language of describing their children as blessings. And many people who I've talked to who say, well, but my child is a blessing, but I just want one and that's it. Do I think of my child as less of a blessing than you? And I say, no, you don't. But what the difference here is that the language of blessing in the Abrahamic tradition, this older scriptural tradition, sees children as similar to wealth, or any other good thing like health, where you wouldn't ever say like, all things being equal, I'm done having wealth or I'm done being healthy. You're like, that was good. I ate healthy for a year. I'm going to go back to my old ways. Like if it's really a blessing, something that's a blessing from God is not not satiatable. So God's blessings don't satiate the way material things satiate. So they're not like consumer goods. And that's something that bears a little bit of discussion because it, like, at first, of course, nobody means to suggest people love their kids less than women who have 6 kids. But it's a different attitude, which sort of sees it as not something that satiates, and that if you're able, you would always want to have another if you're able. So it's like a disposition to receiving more spiritual wealth, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Roxanne, you want to jump in?
I was just thinking about how in the garden, it's really similar. It's like sometimes you get so much more than you anticipated, and you have to get out there and you have to work to put it up, and you have to, take care of things. And it's kind of the same with a large family. It can feel like too much, or it can feel like a blessing, and I think any blessing could, like if somebody left you a whole bunch of property to have to take care of, it could feel like, oh, this is too much, I don't want this. Or you could feel tremendously blessed by it. And so I think
Right.
perspective in the way that, like the way that the women spoke about having family in your book was, a lot of them seemed to be on the same page about the way that they were viewing it, which was why they were staying open to it, and sort of an assumption that God has their best will at heart and is going to, God wouldn't give them, this if it wasn't a blessing. So there's
Right.
like a certain amount of trust
Yes.
and faith involved. I found it interesting. One of the woman who really fascinated me was one who's an academic, and who I think she said that maybe she had not wanted to have any children,
Yeah.
and then she ended up having 4,
Yeah.
and that was a surprise to her. And she actually did she convert to Catholicism too during
Yeah.
that kind of, and
That's
she was
right. I mean, she's not
totally
really.
atheist before.
Yeah, that's right. Her husband was from a Catholic family and had given up practicing when they met. Like they met in grad school and he wasn't Catholic anymore, but he'd hung on to the idea that you shouldn't use birth control because it was unnatural. And so they were dating and she's just like, what is that? Like who leaves, like, don't people leave Catholicism because of that? Why did you leave Catholicism and stick with the idea that you shouldn't use birth control? So yeah, ultimately they both end up going to church again. Like, so first he comes back and then she joins him. They kind of go back to church together. That's a great
And she
story.
felt like such an outlier in
Yeah,
her academic career. She's
that's
like
right.
hardly knew anybody who had kids.
That's right.
Um, and they were sort of like, why are you doing this? And she
Right.
said something like, this isn't all we are. Like, she didn't know what her faith was at that time, but she knew that there was something more going on than
Yeah.
the physical
Yeah.
world. And she felt sort of thrown that these super intelligent people didn't feel that way too. Like, do you really
Right.
think this is all we are? Do you think this is
Yeah.
all it is? And that was kind of like, I thought
Yeah.
it was an interesting portrait,
She articulated a lot of things so well. Yeah, she had that idea. She said, like, you we are used to being looked down on as somehow like less intelligent or less valuable members of the academic community because we're doing this thing. We have these kids, and she said, but like like we're obviously more than that, and like they also had this funny thing where she said something like, you have no idea the level you have to be operating on to sort of like balance these two careers, and and I was like, oh, you're speaking my language. I
This is
definitely
so, oh
understand
my
that.
gosh. So this is so funny. I was pregnant in grad school, obviously in sociology, focused on the environment. So I had these two
Amazing.
professors who were, one was a demographer and the other is a pretty well-known environmental sociologist. And they adopted a daughter. And the woman said to me one time, I think I'm like 7 or 8 months pregnant, like, well, of course, as an environmental sociologist, like I would know to like adopt and not have my own kind of thing. And I was just like, oh,
Ooh.
got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But like, what a thing to say. But anyways, I was just thinking like there is a point at which there's a divergence and there's no rational argument to make. The argument is truly just one of like a set of beliefs about what is true and good and meaningful in life. And it can't be argued in this other like scientific and rational way. It like the
That's right.
fundamental lovability of people, the importance of the human,
That's
um,
right.
and so like it's just a kind of split, and there's really no way to address that chasm other than a way of thinking, a culture.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think a good example of this is kind of an economist who I like and I quote a lot about, who worked on the environmental questions and population, was Julian Simon. And I know he might be too optimist for some people, but he's great because at some point he's like, look, like this, all this Malthusian doomerism was always wrong. It's always been wrong, and and you're like, okay, good. So you've set the record straight in terms of the past, but it's still the past. Like ultimately, I'm with Simon. Like I expect that more people will not be bad for the planet, for society, for other people. But that's not an axiom of economics. That's something that you really have to rely on something from outside of the field to gain that confidence. And you can make the case, right? You can say, I think it's more likely to expect that what happened in the past will continue to happen, right? Like that, but you're just you are extrapolating. You're making a prediction based on the past, and so yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah. And I mean, we've had a whole other several discussions on this podcast about like what can happen with the environment. And this is why I'm not really like a degrowther, because I think I just know all these regenerative farmers, and it's not a matter of just humans, like this Malthusian idea that like humans are just consumers of resources and will necessarily pollute. But there is a different way in which humans can relate to the environment that actually increases its
100%.
capacity and increases the functional ecosystems. Okay,
Yes.
while we have only 5 or 10 minutes total left,
Okay.
I'm wondering if we can turn toward, let's just say, a young woman and young women and men.
Hmm.
What advice do we give them if they're thinking, I do want to get married, I do want to couple up, I do want to have kids? Like, what's the right approach, orientation as they're in this period?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I've taken to saying, which I think is really true, is I think that given we're generally in this we're still in this kind of antenatal trough, and I'm kind of optimistic that the pendulum will swing as people talk a lot more about like how valuable children are. But in any case, at the moment, I should tell you, you have to plan for your family and plan for your children. I think it's still the case that the messaging for young women and young men to some extent is like plan for your career. Plan like so that the planning is really oriented as if like just this Malthusian thing, as if like the mating and the childbearing will just happen, like because of course you're
Right.
going to couple up and copulate. Like all the evidence says it goes the other way. Like at the moment, you're on that train. Certainly as a woman, I don't know what it's like to be a young man in society, but when I was a young woman, although I lived in communities that were generally very pro-child, nobody said to me like plan your family. They said plan for your career, to take all the tests and like get all the applications in and like go do the most, ambitious thing you could do. And they were like, rah, rah, like, it's great. We're really excited that you're so smart and you're part of our community. And it was like, I look back at it, I'm like, this is so ridiculous. Like what we did is so ridiculous. So I think it's really helpful to say, look, nobody is going to plan for your family for you, and the social script, the mile markers, you're gonna be asked to check all these boxes that have to do with other things. So I think number one is just like, it's not weird or strange to be like, say, when you're 19 or 20. Um, if you're using dating apps, I'm not sure I recommend dating apps, but if you're using them, and it seems like everybody's using them, that has to be like at the top of your profile. Like, like that this is something you really want to arrange your early marriage around the openness to having children, in the same way that like those Abrahamic faiths, those religious communities that we've talked about, they will view matchmaking as something like we're going to help young people meet each other who want to like get married and have a family. So that was a big part of some of the interviews where people said, we weren't getting married to wait to have children. Like, we knew that our whole reason for getting married was to start a family, and to start a family right away. So that's almost a direct quote from one of the. So I just think that's intentionality can overcome a whole heck ton of problems in life, and we see this as increasingly true in all areas of human life. From health and wellness to fitness. So I think intentionality and kind of seeing that you have to plan for this, and it's not weird to be out there like dating and telling people like, hey, I'm only interested in pairing up with people or matching up with people who really want to start a family. So I
Right,
think
right.
that's fair.
Yep. And I think about this a lot. I mean, I have 3 girls. Roxanne, you have 5 girls, and like we've
We should
talked
get
about this.
my boys and your girls together.
I was just gonna say that. So Roxanne and I have talked about this before, like
Yeah,
soft arranging and just
percent.
talking to your kids about
Yep,
like the
yep,
expectation for life. Like I grew up, kind of like middle class, family in Chicago, and it was just kind of like family was obviously the first thing, and then they were like, you're ambitious and smart, so you should follow those things. But there was always like, who are you married when you having kids,
yep,
kind of mentality, and when are you having your
yep.
next one kind of mentality. And it
Right.
was just like we can do that as parents, set that expectation. My mom said I got married at 26 and it was a great age to get married because I had like some youth, but then I was like not I was young enough when I started having kids that I could chase them around. And I was like, okay, I just followed that advice. So if you have this intentionality, you tell your kids like the expectation, I think that can
Yeah.
help a lot.
Yep, exactly. And then I think the other piece of that is, as women who may be called to do other kinds of work, I think everybody's really going to be different in that respect. To see that there's again, intentionality covers a lot of defects, right? We'll say like, so I knew that for me, having children was more important than writing papers or getting through my PhD quickly. So it was always just a matter of like, well, it's one at a time, but like, well, would I like to write the next paper or have this next baby? And for me, so I've often said like, if I'm really interested in all manner of people's interests and their vocations, like how they feel called, but that what I've seen among people who have managed to have the families they want to have is you fit your career around your children rather
Hmm.
than your children around your career.
Hmm.
Because
Yep.
what people do is they like look for these natural breaks in their career. They're like, okay, between these two things, I'll have a kid, and I think that tends to backfire a little bit more than people realize, because it creates these like bars you have to meet and that kind of thing. Back to the point you made before. So I think that intentionality is saying like, what's more important to me? If my family is more important to me, then just go for it. Like, have your baby when it's best biologically, best in relation to your marriage, the health, and then just go for it, and then just fit your career around that. And actually, like, it's never been easier to do work in a flexible way, or to pursue creative things that our grandmothers wouldn't have had the option for. Like, they were looking at literally like, go be a secretary, go be a teacher. Like, these are very rigid things that have very specific time frames, whereas like my work life is totally bizarre, like in terms of the hours I keep, right? So yeah, I just think a slight change of perspective. Pick your family goals because they're more important, and then fit your career around that.
Yeah,
And it works.
totally.
It seems to be possible for us.
Roxanne, do you have any last questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the messaging that I'm giving my kids. I say, look, here's some things in my life that I did that were really great, that were really a lot of fun, but having you guys was the best thing. And I just want you to know that moving forward, like life has so many opportunities and you might have dreams and you can do a lot of things. But I think the messaging of I mean, I was 27 when I had my first child, and people acted like I was some kind of child bride.
Yeah, same.
They were like, "You're only 27, you know?
It's amazing.
Women's supposed to have kids. They're supposed to have like exactly one kid at age like 32 and a half now. And
Yes,
that's,
because by
I
the
don't,
time you're 35, you're of geriatric maternal age.
Yeah.
so I
Which
told
is
my girls, we will, if you want to live at home while you go to school, do that. You can go to school, you can live here, you can save your money, you can start a business, like whatever. We're basically like, we're home until you want and start home if that's what you want. I mean, if
Yeah.
they want it away, we're not going to stop them, but we wanted them to feel supported so that they could do what they wanted in their early adulthood, like go to school or until they start a family. And I've said, I think it's a great idea to finish your school. And then if you have an opportunity to use your degree later, like you can do that. Or like the woman, the doctor in your book who, she worked like part time as a pediatrician, but was able to support the family
Yep.
working part time
Yep.
as a
A really great.
her husband was a stay at home dad and she
Yep.
still got to spend a lot of time with family. So there's lots of different ways that life can be
Right.
structured that
Right.
works and to encourage them in that because I think the messaging we were giving was really poor. All the sitcoms, movies, everything was like marriage is sucky, kids are so tough, it's gonna ruin your life, and like it's all terrible. And when really family life is the best thing, and it's hard sometimes to share that with people that aren't in that season. It's like really good, and even when it's hard, I wouldn't trade it for any other kind of hard. So, you know, I don't know. That's my
That's
Totally.
great. That's great. This was such a nice conversation. Thank you both, Roxanne, Catherine. This was so nice to chat about these things, and we could go on and on, but this was lovely. Thank you both.
Great.
yeah.
Absolutely.
It was really
Likewise.
nice to meet you, Catherine, and thanks
Likewise.
thanks for coming on. It was
It
good
was
to see
great. It's a privilege. Thank you.
you. Okay.